Okay, we're going to go through several things today. You'll notice I've got 7 sheets down here. Um, by the way, an Excel file is called a workbook. Each of the tabs down here is called a sheet, at least initially, right? I can rename these as I right-click on that. I can rename them. I can delete it. I can protect a certain sheet, meaning that nothing can be edited on that sheet. I can change tab colors, right, just for easy reference, those kind of things. I can even hide tabs, hide sheets. I can move them around just by grabbing it and moving it over, right? I'm not going to do that at the moment, but that is possible within this as well. In case you get working on things and then decide you want to move them around, it's pretty handy. But let's start out today as we go through these. We're going to create a graph or a chart here. So I'm going to grab the data first. I'm going to go to Insert, and I could go and have Excel recommend a chart to me, but I'm just going to go ahead and choose this variety here, right? I can move this around within here. I can rename the table or the chart, right? I can go temperature data, right? Something like that. I'm not sure why it just did that, right? But I can do that as well. I can come in here and you're going, okay, what is that? Right? I know what it is, right? Because we've got the data right over here, but I can also add data labels in on all those, right? So those actually show up in there. I can add the data table itself below it, right? All of those kind of things are possible. I can come into this and make it bigger if I want to, right? So I don't have things tripping over themselves, meaning that this number right here ends up on the bottom of this, right? So you can't read it very well. Now I can actually have Wednesday all on one line as opposed to kind of weird, right? So I can do all of that within this, and it's pretty slick. And you can make whatever kind of chart you might want to make. There are all sorts, right? So if I grab these again, right, I can go look at recommended charts, right? It'll show me things I can do. But you'll notice I can do anything from pie to what they called hierarchy charts to waterfall. Play with it, right? I think it's fun. I recognize that you may not, and that's okay. But it is pretty neat. Okay, I'm going to get rid of this little tab over there on the right. I'm going to move over here to sheet 2. So this is pretty interesting within Excel, and this is where we have to remember those kinds of things called order of operations from back in high school, maybe middle school, right? Those things that we learned about when we multiply first, when we add and subtract, right? All those kind of things. And you'll notice, as I mentioned earlier, right, these are numbers in here, but they're not showing up. And why is that? Pausing for you to think about that and remember, right? It's because my column's just a little too skinny. Right, so I can see I do this, and this is what it pulled it all the way out that far. I don't care that that's out that far because there's nothing after this row of data, right, or that those words, right, that explanation of what that is, right. So if I want to come in here and calculate person trips, right, you can see the formula that we're going to use for that right up here, right. And so when we look at this, we understand that in between A and that parenthesis, we know that there's a multiplication symbol in there, but we don't write it when we write out the formula. But Excel isn't going to assume that, right? So we have to be very explicit for Excel in this situation. And not only do we want to use, I'm not going to come in here, for example, and type, okay, A is 1 million, right, times, right? I'm not going to do that. I'm going to use the cells, and I'll show you again why here in just a moment, right? So equals, right? How we start out every formula. You're going to get sick of me saying that, right? And so I need a parenthesis here, and then I'm going to take this, right, A, and multiply that by 1 minus PL, right? Then I'll close that and divide it by F, close my next parenthesis, and then divide that by this, right? So I'm all set. Now I can just hit enter on my keyboard, right? And that's that. Did you notice? I just double clicked back into that cell. Did you notice that this B9 is blue and this is blue? that C9 is red and this is red, right? So Excel's trying to help us see visually what we're doing, right? So blue, red, purple, green, blue, red, purple, green, right? So just wanted to show that to you. Now, here's the cool thing, among many, again, in my opinion, within Excel. You notice when I'm just floating around, I have this kind of white cross, if you will. If I come in here and I hover over the lines of this, right, I can move this around. I could change that and drop it down into year 3. Sometimes that works within Excel. Sometimes it's going to do things you don't want it to do. One of the cool ones is to come down here. You'll notice in this bottom right-hand corner of that cell, the green square in the middle is just a little bit bigger than the rest of it. And you'll notice that if I hover over that, my cursor will turn black. If I drag that down, right, I got numbers too big again, but you'll notice that all of these in this first cell, right, B9, C9, D9, right, all are 9s. If I come down here, now they're all 10, 11, 12, 13, right? So Excel assumes that as I go down to this cell, as I essentially what I'm doing by dragging this down from here is copying what's in this cell down to the next one. But as it goes down, it's assuming that I want to use these data for this one, just like I use these data for this one, right? And so I keep on coming down, and you'll notice that they all change. I'll show you how to not have Excel do that here in just a minute, actually on the next sheet. Right, so now here I can just calculate the average of this cell, of those cells above it, right? And I can do that as I move it over, right? You're going, wait a minute, why is that 0? Those are percentages, right? This is because this cell isn't formatted to be a percentage. Okay, so let me come back up to home, change it to a %, and now I can come up here and actually increase my decimal, right, so that it's more or less the same as what that is. Now here's another thing I want to show you. As I've talked about this format painter up here, this is a percentage. I need this one to be a percentage as well. So I can come here, click on format painter. You notice it's got a little paintbrush, and I can drop that there and it'll format this cell the same way. I want to move this out to be another decimal point, and I can come out here, right, I could go a long ways. No point in doing that, right? And then I can just reduce it. Whoop, I don't want to do that. Right, but I can do that here, right, and just change, right, how many decimal points I want to have show up. You know, I could take this one out further if I wanted to. Again, there's just, you know, we can talk about significant digits, right, sig figs, all that stuff that you learned at one point as well. Me too, way back, but my wife's a science teacher, so I hear that more often, right? So that's kind of how this part of this works, okay? We're going to move over to, and don't worry about person trips and what all this means. This is actually from my dissertation. You don't need to worry about that part of it, right? What we're talking about is how do we create formulas in Excel that give us good information, right? And then we get something like this, right? So here's a grade book, right? And some of these cells fit, some of them don't. You'll notice I went up here to A, right? You notice my little down arrow, so it's choosing that whole column, and I pick this whole thing. If I double click between any of these cells, it automatically fit every single column into, right, what it needed, no more. Right, you notice that the candy bar one's a little bigger because candy bar is bigger than quiz 3, so this column's a little bit wider than this column, right, etc. So now I want totals for all of these students. Right, this is all made up data, made up names, by the way. Okay, so I want to take and figure out what the total is for each student, including the total possible for this class. So I want, right, sum. I'm going to grab all of that. Okay, and I actually want attendance, even though it's kind of covered up by the formula there. Close my parentheses, right, hit enter. There are 850 total points possible in the class. I can come back here to this, and it's going to add all of these up at the same time. Now, because this one was bold, it's making all of these bold. Right? If you don't want that, you can highlight that group and click bold and get rid of that. Now, I want the percentage that each student has in this class. Right? To calculate the percentage here, right? This is a twofold lesson. Some people don't know how to calculate a percentage. Right? So in this case, the percentage is calculated by taking this cell, right? The total points that Beltran has in the situation and dividing it by the total points possible, right? That's going to give me a decimal, right? And I can change that to a percentage. I can bump it out a little bit, and then I can drop that down. But then as I drag that one down, you notice they have 641 out of 850. How is that 107%? Right? Okay, this is where Excel is assuming things that I don't want it to assume. Right? And this one is taking y3. If I double click that, right, y3 divided by y2. I don't want to change that, right? As I come down to this one, though, it's taking this and dividing it by Beltran's, right? So I want Excel, as I move down, to stay home, right, to stay in that total cell. Right, so what I need to do here, right, I want it to stay still. I could just take, and what I do is I put a $ in front of 2, right? In this case, we're not calculating things that go this way, right? All I'm doing is calculating each one of these, dividing the total points that they have by the total points possible, right? So if I put a $ in front of the 2, it means it's going to stay in that second cell. I'm not having it move outside of Y, but as I come down, the number increases, right? And the $ in front of it means stay in 2, right? Stay in that cell, right? So now as I pull this down now, you'll notice that this stays as Y2 all the way down, right? So now I have an accurate representation of what these folks have in this class, right? Good old Stansbury down here with 93.5%, right? Another 90 in here. I've got others in the 70s, 80s. I got a 60 there, right? Whatever, right? And so that's how I can do that. That's how I can hold a cell constant in a formula. If you know you're just staying in this particular cell, let me show you a different shortcut. Let me get rid of those for just a moment. So if I come back to here, and I'm still in this point, and I've gone, okay, y3 divided by y2, I can hit F4, function 4 on my keyboard, and you notice that this puts a $ in front of the y and the 2, right? So it's going to stay there. Now that would be true if I moved this way as well as moving this way, right? Because it's going to hold y constant and it's going to hold 2 constant, right? And now as I drop this down, I'm going to get, those are the exact same answers that we had before, right? But what happens if I realize, oh, dang, you know what? This quiz was actually worth 50 points, right? Notice that this is going to change to 850, excuse me, to 900. Actually, it'll change to 890, right? 40 more points. But it's also going to change all of these percentages for me, right? So now this is 890. This person who had 93% before, right? She, well, I don't know if this is she or not, he or she, and Stansbury, right? They're both under 90% now, right? Because that's taking that into account. Oh, you know what? This person here, Johnston, actually got 50 out of 50 on that. You'll notice that this is going to change from 80.8 to 85.3, right? So that's the cool thing about doing it this way, right? Because as I do things, it will automatically update the rest of it for me. Okay. And you'll calculate average and standard deviation for each one of these. You know how to do average. Let me show you standard deviation real quick, right? STDEV, right? You'll notice that there are a whole bunch of deviations or different types of standard deviation. We're just going to go with good old standard, STDEV, right? So as I do that, I put my parenthesis out front. You'll notice, yes, once again, that there's an equal sign in front of that, right? Close my parenthesis, right? 2.6. That is essentially, we're not going to get into the exact statistics of this at the moment, but a standard deviation is basically how big the spread is between these numbers. Okay, right? Because we've got, you know, the average might be the same for these two, for example. They're not, but they could be, right? And now I can just move this over, right? You notice that most of these are 10s. The exception is the one person who either didn't take the quiz or failed it, right? The group work didn't show up, whatever it might be. Right, and so the standard deviation is much smaller. But if that person had also gotten a 10, the standard deviation would be 0, right? Everybody got a 10, right? And so that's just another measure for showing me, you know, I might have 2 of these quizzes that are exactly, maybe the average is exactly 8, right? But if the standard deviation is 0, that I know that everybody got an 8. If the standard deviation is 2.7, I know that I've got a lot of people. The average was 8, but I've got some people down there at 5 and 0 and right different scores, right? Okay. All right, moving on from that one. So I'm going to ask you to make sure that you, well, yeah, once again, my problem that I'm not really interested in completely moving that over, right? But if I want all of these to be numbers, right? And I'm also going to want the rest of this to show up with dollar signs in front of them, right? Highlight that section, hit the dollar sign. Now in this case, I'm going to say I don't care if they have the decimal points after. I'm not interested in pennies on this. They're all 0 in this situation anyway. I can move that over, right? Profit is calculated by taking sales minus expenses, right? So that's what Brooke, she brought in almost 65,000. Her expenses were a little bit over 32,000, and her net profit then is the difference between those two, right? I can drag that down and it's going to calculate each one, right? I can take the total for this, right? Sum, I can grab all those, right? And now I can do this as well. I'm actually going to copy, I don't want the total of those, I want net profit, right? And I'll make that a little bit bigger to show that, okay? And that's for everybody, right? Okay, now their commission is 5%, okay? I want to take 5% of this and put it in that cell, right? What am I going to put first? Yes, equals, okay? This times 5%, right? And Brooke's commission on these sales over time minus her expenses is $6,400. Excuse me, $1,600. Now I want to do this for Darla, but I want to use this cell, right? Right? I don't want it. Okay, so it's the same thing. Equals. Actually, I can do this, right? I can come back up here, and I want this to stay in C17. I hit what on the keyboard? Yes, F4. You're right. Right, and so that puts the dollar signs around it, right? So I'm getting the same answer for that, but now that as I drag that down, right, you'll notice that these are all C17. This is all that 5% of this, right? These are moving down, D7, D8, D9, D10, but because I put the dollar signs around it, right, in front of each of those, that's going to stay the same. Well, what happens now if my commission changes from 5% to 7%? I click 7 in there, excuse me, you notice, and I hit enter, right? All of these just went up, right? Because it's doing this. If I went in here and did C17, instead of doing it this way, right, and did, why are you moving over there for me? Okay, right, if I come over here and put 5%, wow, okay, not sure why it's giving me grief. Okay, but instead of that I put 5%. Okay, I'm not sure why it's doing that. Okay, the point is, if I put D7 times 5%, I would have to change that 6 times to get this done. Now I change it once. Maybe this goes to 4%, right? And it changes it automatically. This is being really not friendly, right? Okay, so that's how that would work. I can do the average of these, right? Of these, right, down in these cells, just like you've done in the past. Okay. All right. Let's hope that Excel will be nice here and not cause additional problems. Right. So in this one, right, I'm going to move that out a little bit so I get the order date and those kind of things. I'll move it out a little more to get the actual dates in there. Right. So I've got minimum and maximum that I want to calculate for these. Right. And certainly it doesn't make sense to do this for, is desk minimum, is pen set minimum, right? It might be able to figure it out based on the alphabet, right? That A is less than Z in some kind of a situation, right? But let's just say I want to do the minimum, whoops, min first, and I'm going to grab all these. I just realized I put that in the wrong cell. Right, so as I drag that down, I'll get rid of it there. This is going to calculate, this is going from G3, right, to G44. I want it from G2, right, G2 down to G43. I can go in and manually change that in theory. Oops. Right, it'll highlight that for me. You can see that, right? And then I can do also the max of that, right? I can go through this and look for, okay, what's my minimum in here? And I can go through this by hand and look, right? What's my low seller? Oh, there it is, right? Central region, Gill, selling pencils, right? Whatever it might be. And I can go through this and find them. But if I have pages and pages of data, right, why would I want to do that? If I'm looking for the minimum and maximum, maybe I'm to define, hey, who's my big seller? Hey, who's my small seller? Right? How do I figure that out? Right? And so I can go through and have it do it for me, right, as opposed to having to try to find it by hand, by eyeballing it, right? And then you get down and realize later on that you messed it up, right? Some different things in here, right? So I'm going to do this because we're going to do some conditional formatting right now too. Okay, so I just highlighted this group of cells. I'm going to come up here to conditional formatting, and I wanted to look at top and bottom rules, right? There's all sorts of different things you can do, right? Greater than, less than, equal to, top and bottom, right? I want to do above average and below average. Right? I'm going to click on above average. I wanted to do these with green. We'll do that one, right? And you'll notice it's hard to tell. I don't have to figure out what the average is. Excel will do that for me and then make the adjustment, right, and then highlight the cell. Right? Now I want to know which ones of these are below average, right? And that's probably going to be fairly obvious unless something happens to be exactly average, right? These I'll do with red, okay? Right? So you notice that this has happened, right? Now, but what happens if all of a sudden I sold actually 25 of those instead? Okay, this isn't a formula, so that's not going to work. I don't want to delete that. Let's put it back to 15. What happens if this ends up at 800 now? It automatically changed to green for me, right? So the point is the conditional forming can help us see things easier, right? It'll change things for us as long as we've got the rules set up the right way. And you can set up lots of different rules. Okay, it just depends on what you want to do and what you might need to do in a certain situation to help you make decisions, right? Some of this is about analysis, right? Not just doing number calculations. In this sheet, and I'm showing you this one is because it's part of an assignment you're going to have, you'll notice, watch this, okay, equals, I can go back to this other cell and grab that cell. You'll notice it's doing equals sheet 5, right, A1, right? Now if I hit enter, right, it's bringing that over. I can now take this, okay, I'm just going to do one bit at a time. Now I can drag that over. That's exactly what I had on the other page, right? The point is, why would you want to do that, right? That's a great question. And you may not want to, but there might be certain pieces of data that you want to bring over from another page so you don't have to copy them and move them over to that second page, third page, whatever it might be. You know, maybe you've got some percentage, right, like we had here, right, based on this commission, and maybe that fits with every single page that you're doing, right? That number is critical. And so when I change it in one place, it's going to recalculate formulas every place else, right? Why have to go do that multiple times and miss something or whatever, right? Have it in one spot, right, and then be done, right? There's more to this one. I'll let you work on that as you do the actual assignment. The last one I want to do here is just talking a little bit about if-then statements. Okay, so I'm just gonna focus on. I've got examples of what these look like, and this is kind of the how these have to work. Right, so I'm gonna open these two just a little bit, so those are both in there. Okay, so now I'm going to use this formula here and put it in here. If, right, equals, of course, if, you don't have to capitalize it, it'll do that for me. If my expenditures are greater than my budget, comma, right, then this is going to put this out, right? If my expenditures are over my budget, right, then I'm over budget, right? That's opposite of what I've got down there below, comma. If not, meaning if my expenditures are below my budget, then I'm under budget, right? And then I close my parenthesis. You notice that these are in quotes, right? Because it's going to put exactly that there, right? And then I can just drag that down, right? I'm under budget here, I'm over in these two, and I'm under again in that one, right? So that's how that works. And you can do this with multiple references, right? If I've got more than 0.9 or 90%, right, then I get an A, 80, B, 70, C, right? And then in the end, right, if it's, you'll notice that this one switched, right? Okay, so if it ends up being less than 60, then that's an F, right? So you can play with those if-then statements as well. So this is a little bit of help on lots of different topics.